Hi, I'm Monica Guzman, host of A Braver Way podcast and your guide across the political divide. Are you done with the divisiveness in our politics and ready to do something about it? Join me as I sit down with guests from across the political spectrum. Together, we'll share tools, insights, and messy real-life stories to help you face this election year without losing heart. Listen to A Braver Way now at braverangels.org/abraverway or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. On this show, we celebrate leaders in peace building, people who help countries and communities around the world find nonviolent solutions to social and political conflicts, and to reconcile across deep divides. Of course, putting peace building to practice is a challenge. As a field, peace building is sustained, albeit insufficiently, with support from multilateral organizations like the UN, USAID, the World Bank, and others. That kind of support requires scrutiny, because when programs are launched without properly consulting the communities they're meant to serve, they're often doomed to fail, or at least have limited success. And when these peace efforts are happening in places where donor countries also have significant military interest, like Afghanistan and Iraq in the post-9/11 years, the picture gets even murkier. Our guest in this episode is a scholar and peace builder who knows this territory intimately. He's worked for major players like the U.S. Institute of Peace and the UN Development Program. He also served in the Obama administration as senior policy advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry. He's traveled extensively in the Muslim world, and he shares our commitment to making peace efforts more visible to the public. Qamar al-Huda is the author of Re-envisioning Peace Building and Conflict Resolution in Islam, published in April 2024. He's currently a professor of international affairs at the U.S. Naval Academy. In this conversation, Qamar shares a refreshingly positive perspective on the possibility of peace in Islamic countries. In his book, Qamar reflects on some of the mistakes made in the early years of the war on terror by the U.S. government and other international actors. He says many of these mistakes were rooted in seeing peace building as a purely secular project, which failed to acknowledge the conflict resolution tools and ethics that exist in Islamic tradition. He also highlights more constructive examples of conflict resolution in the Muslim world. Making Peace Visible's producer, Andrea Maraskin, asked Qamar about the book and for his advice for peace builders and journalists working in Muslim-majority countries.
Qamar al-Huda, thank you for joining me. Welcome to Making Peace Visible.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
The name of your new book is Re-envisioning Peace Building and Conflict Resolution in Islam. What motivated you to write it?
Well, when we think about conflict resolution and how to build peace around the world, there are numerous, participants in the world, international organizations like UN, the US, and other state actors. But here I focus specifically on why religious actors or religious communities have a very unique and particular contribution to conflict resolution and building peace in Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries. In the first few chapters, I'm trying to make a case on how sometimes even within the larger field of conflict resolution and peace building, religion is seen as sort of a footnote.
So even though it's an academic book, it really feels like there's a strong personal relationship or a personal foundation underlying the book. I wonder if you could lay out a bit your personal relationship, not just with conflict resolution, but also with Islam.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, not obviously, but I try to lay out in the book that I'm a believing Muslim and I'm practicing Muslim. And over the course of my life, and when I started traveling and exploring the Muslim world, you come across many, many varieties of religious practices and beliefs and sects and different histories and cultures and many different languages. And so writing this book, I wanted to capture the folks that tend to be ignored in peace building, which is really the contemplative tradition of Islam, the Sufism, which is a major focus on how they think about peace and working to limit conflict. I think they are usually ignored. I think their big attraction is what's sexy in the headlines, Islamist parties or political Islam or jihadis. And I think a generation of those sort of headlines, literature, has really skewed who are basic, pious Muslims trying to do good work in their communities. And it occurred to me that even in my earlier work, that I was also chasing the headlines and writing maybe to contribute to that. And then I wanted to recorrect myself and say, I've been ignoring this world that has a vast literature, of course, of Sufism and theological work, philosophical work, practices, and so forth, but not really known in how they resolve conflict and how they think about the world and what they do with pluralism, how they deal with differences. So that's my personal connections. I've had many teachers over the years within this tradition, and I thought I should really collate and bring and synthesize some of their contributions.
So if you could summarize it, in a few sentences, what is the framework for building peace as you understand it in Islamic thought? What's the core of it?
I think the tradition that I'm studying and I put out is that it really thinks about human beings as all on a particular journey towards the divine or to the one, and folks generally need to be tolerant of their journeys. And in this process of sort of unfolding and rethinking about themselves and relating to others, there are ways to handle and to deal with things that are not compatible with another person's aim. There are specific ways in how to mediate or how to reframe something. This is a reflection process of like, wait, let's pause and let's think about what is being done to me. And let me think about what other perspectives are there. Reflecting is definitely fundamental. And two, if you get to a point where things are incompatible, then there's a way to handle these things between someone who's an elder or someone who's more wiser. So there's a sort of involvement, community involvement or an elder involvement to oversee that this is resolved. And the whole thinking is that things cannot just linger on with resentment, with antagonism, with hatred, with prejudice. We need to resolve this in your lifetime now, whoever has hurt you, vice versa. And the reason you're doing that is because if you're not at peace with yourself, then you're not going to be in peace with your spiritual journey.
I'm imagining that perhaps there's a parable from the Quran or Islamic history that teaches conflict resolution skills. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, there's several parables. One of the things, of course, is a historical moment, if I can say it. The troops, I guess, in the 8th century arrived to Jerusalem, and the leader of the troops at that time, he obviously saw a Christian community. And this Christian community was pretty much in Jerusalem, the backwater of the Roman Byzantine Empire was left, by itself. So it was overtaxed. It was just a really horrible, like sort of trash everywhere, not much attention. And his famous statement in this, which I memorized when I was 4 or 5 years old, because it was taught to me, which is that the Christian community will remain a Christian community and our community will be here to be supportive. And anyone who attacks or sabotages us will have to deal with me as the leader. So this idea that there's different traditions and acknowledge each other, support each other if you can, but you don't purposely undermine each other or to try to destroy each other's institutions.
What is the concept of jihad within Islam? And what do peace builders who are working in Muslim majority countries need to understand about it?
In this context, in the contemplative tradition in the Sufi world, jihad is used quite often, the term. They use it in the term that's original intention, that is to have a strong intention to struggle to always correct yourself and to strive towards a better version of yourself, trying to strive towards actually a reunion with God. And so your jihad is to correct yourself, work on your ego, work on your anger, work on your biases, work on your desires, all desires, actually. So in a nutshell, that's what jihad is, to manage that, to navigate through these issues and to make sure you're not as wounded as possible. Whatever wounds you have, you recover with guidance and with support.
So can building peace be a jihad?
Yes. Oh, definitely. It is. Building peace is a type of jihad. And to do that, one would work on your personal level, which is if I want peace in my life, I have to work on my anger. I have to work on my desires. I have to work on my ego. I got to work on, my ulterior thinking and agendas, as well as what everyone else is trying to impose on you.
So, Kamar, now I want to get into your critique of how the foreign aid community approached the early years of the war on terror. Let's start in Afghanistan. You wrote that the war on terror, quote, secularized international assistance. What do you mean by that?
The way they started, like all institutions, whether it be USAID or Defense Department, there was not really the best sort of culturally sensitive ways to think about the local communities, which is, this is what we think, what is peace. This is what we'd like you to do. And in this process, we think, that this is how you should use the funds, and we'll help you with the ways to get these funds. But to do peace is basically a very secular approach, ignoring the religious context, ignoring the cultural histories, ignoring the ethno and diversity of religious landscape. And I think that only came about maybe towards the last third of the war.
You mean actually acknowledging the religious landscape only came out around the last third of the war?
I think there was a time when they said, let's try to use religion and the religious scholars, the imams. Let's just try to use their religious institutions, the schools, the students to go to schools. Let's use all the network of the imams, all the different sects, and try to support them or patronize them so they will be more or less supporters of our agenda. And so what this causes is a schism, because if you have, let's say, 5 groups on the ground, and of the 5 groups, 2 groups get money from the U.S., the other 3 groups have this intense resentment, not only resentment, but they also think you are collaborators and you're cooperating in such a way that is undermining the rest of the country or the culture.
It's quite complex. Another thing that I want to get at is you wrote the tone of international assistance, or the focus after 9/11 was to emphasize security rather than peace. What's the difference?
The difference is that they wanted, again, the first 2 or 3 years I recall very, very vividly, what was needed was intelligence, local populations who knew the language, who knew the networks, who knew the different tribes, to be interpreters or translators of the culture and region. This was directly linked to defense funding, and this was directly linked to finding particular resources or assets and trying to disrupt them or, take them as interested folks. And so they were arresting not only the early days of all these different Al-Qaeda so-called operative, but anyone who may have been associated in this process, right? So they were looking for people who can just help them work the landscape and maintain some sort of security that's going to secure their own forces, but as well as secure the newly installed Karzai government.
So you're speaking about Afghanistan specifically.
I'm speaking specifically about Afghanistan back in 2004, 2005, or 2006, and then same in Iraq. So what really happened was, what you're doing is really trying to secure and prop up a particular government that needed security as fast as possible. And in this process, you're rounding up lots of random people, and sometimes you're using intelligence of local people who may, in fact, be using or misusing this. So if there's tribal rivalry, someone would say, I may not like that tribe, or I have a history of conflict with this tribe. People were wrongly gathered and collected and tortured because of this securitization approach. In the process, you're not really doing anything for peace, are we?
But something also that you wrote, there was this system of identifying moderate Muslims to work in counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, and peace building. So I was thinking that given that the framework was so secular, you might even say anti-Islamic or even suspicious of Islam, it seems like a very awkward position for a Muslim to be in.
I think you were saying it very kindly, yes. I try to reveal and rehash and rethink about those days because I don't think they are really gone. And we sort of want to hide this period, but there was a period of, works that came out by scholars and thinkers that all influence policymakers of what's wrong with Islam, what happened, how to win hearts and minds, if you might remember.
I
And
remember.
all of these efforts were built on thinking of how essentially this part of the world is incapable of modernizing, incapable of operating in the modern world, is always sort of locked into wars and endless battles. And then you would hear people say, "Oh, this place is always in war against each other." But there's a whole like literature propelling this part of the world, the Muslim world, cannot and refuses to take the reforms as Europe did. Right? Europeans, they had to remove religion from public life, and you had a slowly gradual secular process where the state became a non-religious entity away from the influence of religious institutions, the separation of church and state. And so people argued that until Muslim countries do this, then it'll always be pre-modern. It won't catch up with the modern world. That's going on at the same time where, well, if we have to work with and operate within these Muslim societies, who do we tap into? And there were famous reports from Rand, from Brookings, from all over in Washington, D.C., and books published that said the best way to do this is you have to find like-minded Muslims. So there are good Muslims and bad Muslims, or moderate Muslims versus the illiberal, conservative Muslims. And so you find the good, moderate Muslims who think and act like us, and then we can tap into them, and they can do many of the services that we need to do.
So we've been speaking somewhat generally. I'd like to look at some specific
Sure.
examples that you wrote about in the book. And, one major threat is religious leaders being exploited or sort of misused by NGOs or governments looking to combat violent extremism. Can you talk about what happened in Pakistan?
Oh, yes. What I'm trying to say is that there are a number of groups that once they become political, then they're organized as a political entity, like an Islamic group. And I have listed up maybe 7 different Islamic political groups. In a country like Pakistan or Afghanistan or neighboring countries, they're heavily watched, influenced by the military and by intelligence. And so a lot of the things they're doing, and whether it be part of countering violent extremism, or maybe they're part of actually advancing extremism, is very much managed by the local military forces and military community and the intelligence community. And they don't just get up one morning and say, "Oh, I want to attack a railroad station," right? And a lot of it's done, if not known or coordinated and supplied with all this information by government. And if you're living there, you just know the level of the hands-on of the government and military in local political affairs. And so the industry which then erupted is countering violent extremism. In order to stop violent extremism or radicalism, we're going to really start inoculating the rest of the population. And that was the thinking. In order to inoculate them, we're going to show, well, this is the right Islam. This is the right way. We're going to have nonviolent approaches to resolving conflict. We're going to be participatory in politics to make a change in our country. And all of these wonderful, very political liberal ideas. However, the reality is when you start tapping into these folks, when you tap into like a religious leader X, Y, or community X, Y, Z, you are also opening them up for many other vulnerabilities locally. Like the intelligence wants to know who they are, who they're working, how much they're receiving through grants, what are their communications. I would be leading a countering violent extremism program with religious like imams in Afghanistan. And every time I led one there or in Pakistan or some other places, inevitably there'd be 3 or 4 intelligence people. And I would ask my local organizers, like, why are they here? It's like, they always come here. This is not a problem for us.
U.S. intelligence?
Local intelligence, so Afghan intelligence in Afghanistan or Pakistan intelligence in Pakistan. And I said, but this is a closed door, 6-day workshop of just all of us really trying to get through and get to know each other and work things out. And just, yeah, well, we can't stop them from being here. They're going to come, listen, take notes, and they're going to file a report. I said, but this changes the dynamics. I would have these arguments, and it changes the dynamics when you have the authority literally at the table. because you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to impose and say the incorrect thing about any place. And then the answer was like, oh, we're used to it. So many times, sometimes they would have come or send a surrogate, someone else, or they would have the local imam, believe it, take notes for them and share the notes later. So my whole point is that this countering violent extremism and trying to help folks to become more informed, better civic members to prevent violent extremism is heavily connected to local intelligence and local military operations and thinking in their structure. And civil society there is heavily controlled and monitored and surveilled. And we were adding to the securitization of these things is the point of that.
So how can peace builders build trust with religious leaders and engage them in a non-exploitive way and hopefully a non-securitized way, if that's possible?
Peace builders are, one, I should just say that they do remarkable work and usually not recognized and all working on a shoestring budget. And they do wonderful work and they do great activities that goes unnoticed. They're doing it already. It's just what I wanted to add is that when Big Brother comes to the table, international donors, then local forces get involved too. They want to be involved. They want money in some of the funds. But look, peace builders, let's say the UN, let's say development program, or when they're operating in such countries, they have a good network of folks, usually local, and they know sort of their networks. And they actually know the areas that need specific work to be done. They know that this area, the youth really could use more teachers, or they could use a better, proper facilities with more equipment and support. And they know that the students are really thirsty for a program where it's hands-on. So not just being stuck in a classroom, but doing community events, having exercises and projects with the community, with the elders and so forth. And so I think the peace builders are very much aware of what could be done, but they're also aware of these other red lines that are there.
I know you were working in Afghanistan before the U.S. withdrawal. I'm so curious, is this peace building work continuing, with the Taliban being the de facto government? Are they still doing great work? And if so, what's an example?
A lot of the NGOs pulled out, they left, but there are hundreds of NGOs still in Afghanistan, and they lost international support. So they rely on local activities or international donations. But there is work all throughout different parts of Afghanistan, whether it's educational, whether it's cultural, whether it's artistic or humanities. But even the very big issue of girls' education, which many of ultra-Orthodox Taliban say this is not going to happen. The other sort of non-ultra-Orthodox Taliban are allowing it to happen. So I know many NGOs with sort of a wink, wink and handshake from the Taliban saying, please use these schools for girls so they can study in different parts of Afghanistan, as long as it doesn't make the papers or radios.
Yeah. And I appreciate that caveat mentioning as long as it doesn't get in the paper or radio, because I think for our project, that's something we've come up against, that we try to promote a positive relationship between media and peace building, but often the relationship is negative because if people found out that these activities were happening, it would undermine the whole thing.
Exactly.
So you did bring up a concept in your book called Islamic feminism. Could you just maybe choose one specific example and elaborate a little bit of women successfully having a role in peace building?
Oh, sure. In Libya, I was able to do some work there, and I was just impressed by many Libyan peace builders from different parts. And if anyone following Libya will know that the country is really torn into this post-Civil War factions, and different tribal factions. And even the government will have, let's say, one faction owns or is running the Department of Defense. One is running a Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. One is running the Public Works. It's so dysfunctional. And in midst of this dysfunction where services are disrupted and schools may not be running, I've come across women. I was in a workshop that asked me to be a facilitator, and I've become really a student of theirs. And I would listen to Libyan women from two different factions who supposedly these factions don't get along. And they're hugging and showing their love for each other. And they're also showing how they would express to the team of, other students and other women that a lot of these divisions are political divisions that were made over time. And they would give this enormous history, 30-minute history of all this stuff, this war and this happened and this to our tribe and that tribe. And then it would say, we don't need to have this in our lives. We don't need to adopt these historical pain, and we can start today fresh. And you see everyone teared up. We have the power to start a new relationship with all tribes, with all different groups. And we can stop the factionalism right here in this room. And then they would have exercises on how to break down those factionalisms, how to break down the biases, inherited prejudices. And so I would see how various female Libyan facilitators, peace builders, would really bring out what we would call an opening, a break in sort of all these stresses and hang-ups and inherited problems.
One of your chapters covers a topic that might be surprising to our listeners. It's about a type of Sufi devotional singing called qawwal. And I know this is very personal for you, Qamar. You told me in our earlier conversation, you told me that you were once a groupie for the iconic Qawwali singer Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So can you explain what is Qawwali singing and what makes it so powerful?
Probably the best answer is that Qawwali is almost equivalent to gospel music in the Black church or most churches. And that it's really meant to be quite emotional and take you to another level of emotional state. And it has its roots in South Asia over 1,000 years ago, where people just sing as a way to show their love for either the prophet or God or the different saints and so forth. So I grew up with Qawwali and all these other art forms of religious arts, music and so forth. And I just sort of never thought about what is it doing and how is it tied to peace or inner peace. And then after some reflection and speaking to lots of folks, there is lots of things with music that it does. It builds this memory and helps you think about things that you never think about. And so, yes, I fell in love with Nusrat and tried to, when I say his groupie, I was basically taking voice lessons with him. And it was great to follow him throughout Pakistan and listen to him. I was really interested in how he converts beautiful poetry into the music he then sang. So I think what this music does is it's helping people to realize when you're in it, when you're really in the moment of that music, you're really lost in it and you're not in the present anymore. You're sort of on this journey. You're being moved by it. And the imagery, the memories of what you're building on, you're not just an observer. I think you're a partaker. I think the musician is trying to get you as a participant into that song, into a particular place. And so if you listen and you grow up with these types of music, whether it be choir music, Qawwali, it's a very soothing way to remind yourself that there's something a lot bigger than you, but you still have access to it and you're still able to connect with it.
Absolutely. Well, let's say, I was a donor and I said, well, I love the Qawwali idea, Qamar. If you could devise a project to use Qawwals to build outer peace as opposed to inner peace, how would you put together a program like that?
I would love to have a Qawwali festival where we had people sharing their art and sharing it, but then also be competition between the different Qawwal singers, but also a little workshops, academies, and how to teach people the different ways to sing, the different styles and different genres. And of course, there's then these different cities and provinces have a different approach. Like Punjabi Qawwali has a more nuanced way than, say, Sindhi or Gujarati or Bengali or something. So there's all these, linguistic differences. So I would have this beautiful festival where, of course, there's music, food, and lots of food and lots of music, lots of also arts. And yeah, that's what I would do.
Oh, that sounds like a great time. In the epilogue to your book, you wrote about the conflict in Gaza, saying there needs to be a new model, a new reimagining of the ways to resolve conflict and build peace in a fragmented and polarized world. How do you envision this new model, and how would it apply to the Gaza war or to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict writ large?
It's a great question. It's also not the easiest. The easy answer is I think I try to show that there is wonderful work that's happening already, and that's within the civil society. And if they could be a bit more supported and carefully supported, I would say, and then I think you'll see a lot more amazing, incredible ripple effect and sort of ways that more networks were developed. Because we think of peace happening top down as one of my contentions when the politicians come together and they sign a peace agreement. But the truth of the matter is within conflict resolutions, peace does not happen after the agreement happens. It actually happens when communities on the local level have to reconcile with each other, right? This heavy reliance that, the UN, the big superpowers will resolve the Israeli-Gaza issue or Israeli-Palestinian issue, or international actors will have one day come to Camp David and sign another agreement. That is a big moment, but it is not ultimately where we should be thinking. That our aspiration should be way beyond that high level. It has to really go the next level, which is professional, working class, local communities, teachers, journalists, youth groups, women groups. They have to rehumanize each other. They have to rediscover who they are and discover ways to live on this earth and how to share that land. And they have to realize that if you really want ultimately the real long-lasting sustainable peace, there has to be real hard look at your own ways of thinking and what you see of other people. And on both sides at this moment, there is a real strong view of the other is, expendable, whether it's Israeli side or Palestinian side. And there's long ways before they resolve that hate. So my focus is to emphasize, to have a new imagination, to help people to people connect, talk, and bypass the politics that is usually manufactured and has an agenda to begin with. And it's very painful work, actually, but it can be done. We've seen it done in South Africa. We've seen it done in many other countries after agreements were signed.
We covered a lot in this interview and in your book. And so I wondered, to sum up, if there are 3 lessons from this interview or from the book, for people doing peace building work in Muslim countries, what would they be? What do you want people to really walk away with?
I think one is to first assess their own organization's goals to see if it's compatible with the local community. A lot of times we have in Western communities, we want this, we want them to be more like us, we want them to act like us, we want to break down patriarchy. And the truth of the matter is, I think any organization needs to operate where those communities are. Culturally sensitive, religiously sensitive, gender sensitive, historical things. So be aware of those things. 2, it's not just about picking people from we used to call Rolodex. I guess now it's on your smartphone, but whoever is on your smartphone. I think we should really broaden our thinking about who we're interacting and how we got this person, this contact. It's good to see who else is out there. It's fantastic groups of people who just go unnoticed, and mainly because they're just not in the sort of network, right? But they don't come with many, many strong recommendations. So I say search and keep looking for good people, particularly women and young women. They get overlooked. Now, my third and final one is, how do you know what you're doing is good work? And I would say we should have those conversations from the beginning before any project and ask local folks, what would be good here? What could we do to do no harm, but at the same time, help you with your vision of building peace in your community? And let them define that. What would it be? Let them describe it. Let them give you that vision. And if you can help in that vision and not be and sort of change it, then get involved. Don't get involved if you can't help their vision. And those would be my top 3 recommendations.
Do you have any advice for journalists covering peace building or conflict in Muslim countries?
I think journalists, of course, first of all, if they're covering conflict and covering places like in these areas, I know they have to be careful and they have to be concerned about so many things. But again, think about you're speaking one language and the other person's trying to speak in that language. So think about the barriers that exist and think about how you can reduce those barriers when you're trying to cover a story. That's one. And two, just be a bit more aware of, what's being told to you. And I would always be a bit more, I would say, judicious about what I'm hearing and listening, because sometimes what you're hearing and covering is sometimes already manufactured for them to cover.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I appreciate you reaching out to us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been really lots of fun.
Qamar al-Huda's book is called Re-envisioning Peacebuilding and Conflict Resolution in Islam. It's available in hardcover, paperback, and as an ebook from Rowman and Littlefield. Making Peace Visible is produced and edited by Andrew Maraskin, with help from Faith McClure. We also had production help for this week's episode from Adam Weiss. I'm Jamil Simon. If you got something out of this episode, here's an easy way to share it. Take a screenshot of your podcast player on your phone, computer, or wherever you're listening. Text that image to a friend or group chat, or post it on your social media with a note about why it's worth a listen. You can also share a link to our website, makingpeacevisible.org/podcast. We found out about Qamar when he reached out to us through our website, and you can too. If you're a journalist, scholar, or peace builder and would like to share an idea for the podcast, drop us a line at makingpeacevisible.org/contact. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.